Thank you for watching this online class presentation from Cedarville University. Our academic enrichment program, The Cove, offers tutoring and disability services to support students on their academic journey. The Cove was recognized by the NCAA for its commitment to student athletes. We invite you to learn more at cedarville.edu.
Let us pick up today with Exodus part 2. Last time we saw that what was amazing about Exodus is that even though it comes 400 years after Genesis, it never misses a beat of the song, right? And so we're really talking about the same kind of things, same themes, all right here. Maybe a different chapter of a book, but hardly a different book in reality. So we're going to take a look at the next step in the fulfillment of the promises, the fulfillment of the nation, and we're going to kind of get introduced today and over the next several days to this big idea of the law. And I want you to really listen carefully because so many people have really naive understandings. They don't understand the law. They've never studied on their own terms. They look at it, you can't eat shrimp, and it seems icky and bloody, and people say, ooh, we're just so glad we don't have to do that anymore. Well, I want you to be far above that understanding and appreciate why God feels like the law and the covenant is a really good idea. So with that, let's take a look at it today. A little preview we're going to look at is this. We're going to find by the end of the book, we have made a major step towards getting back to Eden. Number 2, we're going to talk about why boasting can be a very unselfish thing to do. Not always, but can be. How we know Israelites loved Kellogg's cereals. Absolutely certain of it when you know the original Hebrew. And number 4, why Jesus may have sensed a little deja vu when he had the Last Supper, which is directly connected to today. So, with that then, let's get on to one of the hardest sayings right here in chapters 13, 14, and 15. And it has to do with the Red Sea. And the statement, of course, is this in 14:4. Which is hard for a couple of reasons. Number 1, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, God says, and he will pursue them. Which is, number 1, kind of bad because it looks like God is forcing him against his will. But then, what's even worse is God says, well, that's okay, because I'll gain glory for myself, right, through Pharaoh and all of his army, and the Egyptians will know I am the Lord. Now, neither one of those works well for most of us because, number 1, it looks like God is this powerful God who's just going to take advantage of Pharaoh and smash him under his thumb. I'll force him against his will. Like, wait a minute, that's not very nice. And then God says, but it's okay because I will look good, right? Like, wait a minute. Are you an insecure sovereign? You have to beat up on someone, make yourself feel. None of it looks really good, right? But that's because we don't know the background. So let me show you that. Let me take a look, first of all, at this first phrase, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. So here's where we have to start. There are 10 times in the passage where Pharaoh's heart is hardened. 5 times he hardens his own heart. So right there, it helps you understand that the definition of harden does not mean force someone against their own will, right? It's not like God is forcing him against what he wants to do because 5 times he does it himself. In fact, other places, the very same word is translated like this, but David strengthened himself in the Lord. Right? And so you take a look at 1 Samuel 30, you realize that David is not forcing himself against his will. He's kind of strengthening his will, right? So harden does mean force against, but to strengthen one's resolve. Or here's another way to say it. Let me give you an example of a couple of kids right across the street at the grocery store. They decide they're going to steal some chocolate bars and go out in the parking lot and eat them, okay? So kid number 1 goes up to the counter, sneaks and grabs the chocolate bar, walks out the door, starts to eat his chocolate bar. Second kid reaches out and he notices that there's a security camera and he says, oh, better not, and doesn't do it. But he walks out and he helps his buddy eat the chocolate bar in the back. Now, in the story, how many thieves do we have? We got 2, right? They're both thieves. It's just the second kid didn't want to pay the consequences. And I can kind of prove it to you if we just change the story. Well, let's do it again. First kid comes up, steals the chocolate bar, goes outside. Second kid comes up, reaches out, sees the security camera, but this time he notices that it's unplugged. So what's he going to do? He's going to do what he always wanted to do. He's going to steal a chocolate bar, not because he's not a thief, but because he just doesn't want to pay the consequences. And so now he steals it and goes outside and eats it, right? So what we've done here in the illustration is we have kind of strengthened his heart. We've taken away the fear of the consequences so that what is really in his heart, stealing, is going to come out, all right? And that's kind of what's going on here. Pharaoh really wants to go smash the Israelites, but he's a little bit afraid to, and God says, let me take away the fear so you will see what you're really like inside, right? So we can translate it like this. What God is saying is, I will strengthen Pharaoh by taking away his fears so he can do what he really wants to do down deep in his heart, right? So God does not force him against his will. God just lets him do what he wants to. Now, typically, God is gracious by restraining us from doing stupid things. But here God says, no, I'm not going to restrain him. I'm going to let him do something really stupid and try to kill the Israelites. But through that, I will gain glory. So let's talk about that phrase. I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all of his army, and the Egyptians will know I'm the Lord, right? Now, typically with one of us, if I want to say, oh, I want to do this feat, I want to win this contest so I can gain glory for myself, that's really stupid and foolish because it doesn't benefit anybody else. But when the world hears that God's name is magnified, that God is an amazing, powerful person, that's good. And here's why. You actually know the name of somebody who has benefited from this. You may not know that you know, but everybody here has heard the name Rahab, right? When Rahab heard about this event, what she said to the spies was, we heard what your God did in the Red Sea, and our hearts melted within us. And we knew that your God was the God of gods and your God was the King of kings, right? And so when God does this event, his fame spreads out and people get saved. So God's not doing this for his own benefit, so that other people can see who he is and get saved, right? So if we can paraphrase the whole thing here, what's happening is this. God says, okay, I'm going to allow Pharaoh to destroy himself, but the positive thing is that this will lead to the salvation of many, many people. Right? So it's kind of really the opposite of what you first think when you read it, but you have to know a little bit of the background behind it. That make sense? You good here with Pharaoh? All right, then let's get through the Red Sea and get into the wilderness. And here is what the geography looks like. We're down here in the Sinai Peninsula. You can tell even from the map that this is not a green area. It's not a real pretty area. But to some of us, wilderness means, oh, in the woods. Well, that ain't what this is like. This is what it looks like, right? This is just absolute barren rock. And so if you don't have some manna from God, you don't have anything to eat, right? So that's what I want to take a look at, this idea of how God provides manna for them. Now, the fascinating part about this, among other things, is we're going to learn another Hebrew word, right? You already know the Hebrew word for laughter, which is Isaac. You know how to say deceive, which is Jacob. You even know how to say he to whom it belongs, which is Shiloh. Yeah, very good. Shiloh. You also know how to say God Almighty, which is El Shaddai. You know how to say I am, which is, you know how to say master, which is Adonai, and you know how to say transcendent God, which is Elohim. Yeah, not bad, not bad. And now you know how to say what is it, right? Because that's what happened. They walked out, they said it, they saw it, they didn't know what it was, and so they said manna, which means what is it? But they did not know what it was. Now here's the funny thing, right? You can imagine that when they go out and they see this, someone says manna, and everybody else says, I don't know, manna, right? What is it? What is it? I don't know. What is it? I don't know. Right? And the funny, they never came up with a better word. They just always called it, what is it? So kids went out, they collected it, they brought it home. They said, hey, Dad, look, it's what is it? And the father says, what is it? And the kid says, what is it? And the father says, don't get smart with me, boy. Teenagers got grounded all over Israel for weeks over this, and it was not their fault. It's just, what is it? Nobody ever came up with a better word. But I'm here to tell you, now having studied for years and years and years, Hebrew and Aramaic and Old Testament studies, I know what manna really was because the text clearly says thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared, right? So these were just, they were just... They're great! They were just frosted.
They're great.
Yeah, okay, so now you know that. What is it? They were frosted flakes, that's what they were. Just a little extra, just kidding about the Hebrew, but here's the point, right? We can kind of joke about this, but really, every day they would wake up and they would say, now, I'm really hungry. Is God going to provide for us today? Right? And so you'd have to wonder, you'd open your tent and say, oh, wow, look, he did again. Right? And I actually think it would be better for us to live in a situation like that than to not wonder where our food's coming from. Because if you think you know where your food's coming from, you're hardly motivated to pray, give us this day our daily bread, right? But it's not just bread that we need. We need strength from God for everything. To live in a sense of dependence upon God, right, was a really, really good thing for their spiritual lives. So that's where they were. That's what manna, what is it? I expect you to work this into casual conversation. You know, what manna? See what people say. Now, let's get on to the heart of the book, and here is the heart of it, 2a. And you're going to see some, for the next several minutes here, you're going to see some fairly precise terms. In order to think clearly and accurately, I want you to reflect these. I want you to be able to use them. And so you can see, even in this little title here for 2a, God constitutes, key word, obviously, his people, key word, into a nation, key word, through a suzerain-vassal covenant. And both of those are key words. Right? So let me walk through it and explain them. First, let's start with the strange foreign words, which are suzerain and vassal. A suzerain is what these people would already know as a conquering nation, and a vassal was a defeated nation. So that when one country conquered another, they wouldn't destroy them. They would enter into a peace treaty, and that's what this suzerain-vassal covenant or treaty was, so that the suzerain had certain responsibilities to the vassal. And they would say things like, okay, we will protect you, we will build roads for you, and all that sort of stuff. And the vassal says, okay, we will pay our taxes, and we will not rebel, and we will not join forces with anybody else against you. So it was this treaty or this covenant that provided for a stable relationship, right? So that's the background, but before we go into it any further, just first a little familiar analogy. Right? When I ask the question, what makes the U.S. one nation, what would your answer be? What is it that actually made the United States into one nation? Well, was it a two-party system? No. Was it national monuments? No. Was it cool World War II aircraft that actually take off? No. It's just a thinly veiled opportunity to show another picture of my dad who flew one of those airplanes. Okay. What makes the U.S. one nation is actually this, right? It's the Constitution. So watch the magic here, okay? 13 colonies plus a constitution equals one nation under God. So here we go. What makes Israel one nation? Exodus 19 to 24, which is their constitution. So here's the magic again. 13 tribes plus Exodus 19 to 24, their constitution, makes one nation. Right? So in other words, the law, which is what Exodus 19 to 24, is their constitution. It takes 2.5 million individuals and it forges them by this treaty, by this covenant, into a nation under God. All right? So, then watch this. The offer comes here in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, where we've seen this briefly before when we talked about the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12:2. God says, I want you to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The condition, of course, is if you obey me and keep my covenant. Now, having been really, really good students so far and good understanders of covenants, shall we then take this and plop it down on top of the covenants as a further expansion? Yes? No? True? False? Shall we? Answer. Sorry, I apologize if I woke anybody up. I'm sorry. I won't do it again. No. This is not the way we want it, okay? Why not? Well, this is a covenant, but this is a very different covenant. So let's go into a little bit of detail here, and I think you have this in your notes. The Mosaic covenant and the covenants we've seen so far are both good, but they're in very different classes. Right? So watch this. What's the difference? Well, we've seen so far that the ones on the left are one-sided, and this is two-sided. Does that make sense to you? Somebody explain it to me. What do I mean when I say it's one-sided? Yeah, God is the only one. It only depends upon Him, right? And with this green one, with the Mosaic covenant, very different than the orange here, not blue, but very different than the orange. Notice it said, if you obey, right? So now there are two people there, God and you, or God and Israel. So that's why we called the ones on the left unconditional. There are no conditions for people to meet. But now on the right, it is conditional because there are conditions which the people have to meet. So that's why we don't want to mix these two. So if you know anything about this conditional covenant now, it looks like maybe it's sort of a step back, but it's not. But let me explain to you how they relate. So what's the connection between these two? Well, if you take a look in your notes, I've written this whole thing out because I wanted you to not have to spend time writing it. I wanted you to be able to think about it and understand it. Right? So 4 statements in your notes right here as well. The difference between them is this. Or the connection is this. God will still unconditionally fulfill His promise to Abraham. The law doesn't change this at all. Even though the law has conditions, it doesn't put conditions on top of the Abrahamic promises. Those will still happen. Trains still coming down the track, right? Point number 2. The law simply serves as a barometer for each generation's relationship to the Abrahamic promises. Now, when I use the word barometer, I could use thermometer, I suppose, but I was trying to go here, maybe it was too fine an analogy, but trying to go for the difference between the thermostat and thermometer, right? The thermostat, you change it, it actually changes the temperature. Thermometer doesn't change anything, it just measures, right? So what the law is going to do is not change anything, it's just going to measure or evidence or show. These are all some of the precise key words I want you to know. The law, or whether or not they keep it or not, is just going to show whether or not people have faith in the promises. So, for example, then, point number 3 here, by obedience to Moses, and I don't mean Moses the man per se, I mean by obedience to the Mosaic law, each generation either shows their faith to Abraham or by disobedience they show unbelief. So the point is this. If they believe in the promises to Abraham, then God will change their hearts and they will be able to show that by keeping the law. If they don't believe in the promises, if they are blue kind of people, then they will disobey the law. The law doesn't change their hearts at all. It just evidences what's in their heart. Right? So one more point then. The law does not make one righteous. Now again, this is the precise language when it comes to celebrations, when it comes to talking about it. I want you to know this language. Does the law make you righteous? Answer, no. Right? What does the law do? It evidences, it shows your righteousness. Okay? It only evidences righteousness. Only faith in the promises actually makes one righteous. So let me make this hopefully make sense across the scriptures and use this little picture. Right? The grace and the faith and the good works represent salvation both in Old Testament and in New Testament. I'm just going to work off of Ephesians, though, because it's a passage that most of us are familiar with, Ephesians 2, 8-10. We've all heard, for by grace he is saved through faith, right? That not of yourselves, it's a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast, right? So you've got grace and faith. Well, what are grace and faith? Well, let me say this, that grace is always the basis for salvation. Now, typically, when people use cute little definitions, like God's riches at Christ's expense, I tend to think those are cuter than they are accurate. But this one's a good one. When you think of grace, you should always think of God's riches at Christ's expense. And here's why. A typical definition for grace would be unmerited favor. Have you heard that definition for grace before? And that's not bad, because as far as you and I are concerned, when God gives us grace, we don't merit that. But The downside of that little definition is that someone did merit the favor which God gives to us. We didn't, but somebody did, and that was Christ. Okay? So when you think of grace, God's riches at Christ's expense, you ought to always think of Calvary. Because the truth is that God is good to us and God forgives sins, not because he wakes up on the right side of the bed and says, wow, I'm feeling really generous today. It's okay. No. Never. God only forgives sins because of the price that was paid back on Calvary. Every forgiveness of our sins goes back to Calvary. In fact, in the Old Testament, every forgiveness of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob's sins always went forward to Calvary, right? So that was the payment for everything. So the basis for salvation, Old and New Testament, is always grace. But just because Jesus has made that payment doesn't mean everybody's saved, because you have to express faith. Faith is then the means, all right? So now we get then to the gold stuff, to the yellow stuff up here. Where does that fit? Well, that fits as the evidence, right? So in the Old Testament, if Abraham has faith, he takes the sign of circumcision as an evidence that he believes. Or in the New Testament, if you believe in Jesus, you get baptized as an evidence, right, that you are saved. Now, where you get in trouble, of course, is taking stuff that belongs up here in the yellow or the gold and trying to put it down here in the blue. But then notice one last thing, and that's this. You find that statement, good works, again, because in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10 it says, for we are created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God has before ordained that we should walk in them. Now, notice that these works are good ones, right? They're two different kinds of works in Ephesians 2, 8-10. One of them is bad, one of them is good. The bad one is when you think you can use works down here or substitute it for grace, when you can work your way to heaven. No. Can't do that. But if you're genuinely saved, if you really put faith in God's grace, it will change your life, and then you will do good works out of the power of that relationship, right? So that basic scheme of salvation is true Old and New Testament. So let's bring the law then back into it and the promises. Given those categories, can you tell me where on the chart on the right you would put land, nation, and leader, or the promises, and then the law? Now, one thing I should say, don't let the colors confuse you. They just randomly matched up here. I didn't mean for them to, but they kind of do, so don't let that confuse you. Where would you, first of all, put land, nation, and leader? Where would you put the promises on the big charts? Is it grace? Is it faith? Is it evidence? Yeah, it actually belongs all the way down here with grace. Why? Well, because the leader here actually is, right, the C over here in grace. Right? So these are the promise is, I will send a leader who will save you from your sins, and that is the greatest expression of God's grace. Right? So the promises are the grace. Now then, for the $20 question, which you don't get $20 for, 500 points. I'll give you 500 points. Okay, 500-point question, where does the law fit? And the answer is, yeah, evidence. You got it by now, right? So it sits up here. It doesn't make you righteous. It just evidences if you are or if you're not, okay? So far, so good. You with me? Any questions about it or comments? You good? Okay. All right, then, let's go on to the next big idea and get back then to Exodus 19. So this is the statement. If you obey, I will make you into a kingdom of priests. And we've seen this before, that the entire nation of Israel becomes a mediatorial group. That is, they are mediators of God's grace and revelation to, let's see, who is that blank spot down there? Yeah, the whole rest of the world, all the other nations, in order to tell those nations about, say it for me, the seed, right? All fits back there together. So we've also talked about the land being an important part of it too. That's why God takes Israel, puts them down the crossroads of the world, so that they can be a kingdom of priests to demonstrate to everybody else. So Moses came and said, God wants to enter into this covenant. Would you like to do it? And of course they say, all the Lord's commanded us, we will do. Now that's a good statement. I mean, that's a smart thing for them to say. But Moses and God particularly say, look, we don't want to coerce you. We don't want to force you into this. Do you really know what you're getting into? I mean, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but are you sure? And so God's counter response is kind of, well, not so fast. Let me explain to you what you're getting yourselves into. And what he does for the next 4 chapters is give them the essence of the covenant. Now, let me just show you in my Bible up here a summary of what that is. So when God says, for example, this is the kind of way I want you to behave, what would be a logical starting point for God to describe the kind of life he expected from them? Yeah, I mean, right there, the 10 Commandments, right? So God says, let's see, don't have any other gods. Don't have any other idols or images. And remember the Sabbath day, and don't profane my name, and be kind to your neighbor, and obey your mom and dad, and don't murder, and don't commit adultery, and don't lie, and don't steal, and don't covet, right? So the 10 Commandments are really a pretty good start in the summary, and what I want to do is just show you some of the headings in my Bible, right? So no idols and altars. You got to treat servants well. You have to tip them when they bring you breakfast. I wouldn't say that, but the idea is you have to be gracious to people. There are laws for personal injuries. If you hurt somebody, you need to take responsibility for it and protect people's property, and social responsibility, be kind to people. There are laws of justice and mercy and annual festivals that God wants you to do. And basically, he's simply saying, I just want you to live life that's different than the pagans, so they will see what a difference I can make in your lives, right? That's basically it. So when they have heard that, then Moses comes back and says, okay, are you sure you want to do this? And they say, yep, that's it. And he says, okay, all right, then here we go. We're going to ratify this thing. We are going to officially enact the covenant. Now, when John Hancock put his signature so large on the document, that was kind of the ratification when the colonies ratified the document, right? But for this, it happens 3 ways. They use blood, they use meal, and they use writing. So let me explain these 3 to you, the way they happened. First of all, let's talk about the blood. Chapter 24, verses 5 to 8. Here's the way it worked. So, Moses sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls for peace offerings to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in bowls, and half the blood he dashed against the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. Now, stop right there just for a second. Book of the covenant. Capitalized book of the covenant. He reads it to them. What do you suppose he read to them? Now, it's not a hard answer. Don't make it any harder than it is. Here in chapter 24, when it says he read the book that describes the covenant, what do you suppose he just read to them? Yeah, probably Exodus 19 to 23, right? That's what he read to them, right? Read all those little laws that we just looked at in the 10 Commandments. So he reads that to them, and the people said, yes, we are willing to do and obey all the Lord has spoken. Okay, that's good. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it over the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant the Lord has made with you. Now, I read it over so fast, you might not have actually caught what he did. What did he do? He took the blood and he sprinkled it on the people. Now, I thought about doing that, like going to Chuck's and getting some blood and bringing it over and, just for fun, just to make the point, right? To teach effectively. But if I did, you would say, you can't do that. That's just so wrong. That's evil. That's disgusting. There must be there are laws that right? I mean, that's what you would say. Well, how do you think they felt about it? Like, oh, Moses, you didn't get, I need some more blood. Give me more blood, Moses, right? No. Well, they were Old Testament people. They were weird. They probably liked it, right? No, I don't think so. I think they were probably just as grossed out as you would be if I took blood and spread it on you. But here's the point. When that blood is sitting there and you see the sprinkles of that blood, and you have just said, I commit myself to doing this, What is that blood supposed to remind you of? If I don't do this, what? I'm going to pay for it with my life, right? Now that's an incredibly sobering thing. You're saying, I'm really serious about this. I really will do this, and if I don't do this, I'll pay for it with my blood. So that's the first way. The second way is this, with a meal. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu go up, and 70 elders go up the Mount Sinai, and they actually have a meal with God. That might seem strange, but in the Middle East, when you have a meal with people, it's a way to say, yes, we are all together. We are in community. We're unified about this, right? So that meal helps seal the deal. Not to try to be a poet and don't know it, but it does, right? It seals the deal. And then finally, the writing on tablets, he writes these 10 commandments on the stone, which is a summary of the covenant. Now, I don't know if that makes any sense to you, or if you see any echoes of that later, but there is another covenant which is made, which is sealed in the very same way. Did you notice this? In the New Testament, Jesus says to his 12, in the same way he took the cup after they'd eaten, saying, this cup that's poured out for you is the new covenant, but wait, well, hold on here, notice the difference. The new covenant what? In my blood, right? So same thing, someone has to die if this covenant gets broken, but whose blood is it now? Right? It's his, not ours, right? And then notice this, when the hour came, Jesus took his place at the table, again, Passover, the Last Supper, and the apostles joined him, and he said, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Now, I don't mean to be flippant or sacrilegious here, but here's my question. You suppose Jesus had a little sense of deja vu here? Like, hey, 1,500 years ago, I remember another meal with another leadership group, right? And then finally, in Hebrews chapter 8, God says, I will write my new covenant on their hearts. So what you got here is, wow, ratification in blood, and then a meal, and then writing, because it's the way God ratifies covenants, whether they're old or new, and he does the same thing in the New Testament, because this really seals the whole thing. All right? So with that, the old covenant is good. We can pronounce the couple married, so to speak. They've entered into this two-sided covenant. Right? And then that leads us then to this, the revelation of the tabernacle. Now, this is, again, not to be flippant, but to reflect some of what I've heard some of you say already. Wow, chapter 25 to 40 was, boring. Well, we wouldn't use that, but right? Because it's like, oh man, it's like reading the furniture catalog. It's just, why so many chapters of it? And they not only give the outline of the tabernacle, but then they review the same stuff all over again when they actually build it. Why is such a big deal here? Well, here's why it's a big deal. This is actually God's house, right? And so what you have here, it doesn't look very impressive, but everybody else has a house just like this, and so God takes a house like theirs, some lessons here we'll talk about later, and God's house is basically a tent. Now, you can see here this is an actual replica in southern Israel. It does not look very impressive, and frankly, it's not. And this is part of the reason why 500 years later, when David comes to town, he says, God, it's not right that I live in this beautiful palace and you live in a little mobile home. Let me build you a better stone temple. And David eventually does that. And here's a little bit of what it looked like. And I show this to you because it's still patterned after the tent. It just is prettier to see. And you can see inside of it, you can see the big cherubims. It's all gold. And there are palm trees up here. And like I said, the cherubim and the gold. And it's just beautiful. And when you walk inside of it, can you remember what the last thing was that was described as, hey, there's lots of gold there, and there are cherubim, and there are palms, and there are... What's it look like? This is like a little Eden. You see this? And God's presence is there. This is Eden all over again. Now, I will admit, it's only a little chunk of ground, just like Abraham owned just a little chunk of ground, but it's a start, right? And so this tabernacle was actually God's presence, Eden starting again. Not very impressive right now, but the fact that what it could become is really, really cool, right? Because the very first thing that we're talking about here in this chapter, chapter 25, is in fact this, the Ark of the Covenant. If you've watched any old Indiana Jones movies, you recognize, maybe, the Ark of the Covenant. But it's called that because it's kind of an ark-shaped thing, and the symbols of the covenant, the Ten Commandments, are in here. Now, these guys on top are the bodyguards, right? These are the cherubim. As we've said before, cherubim guards the way to the tree of life, and the cherubim are always protecting. And God's presence is right there between them. In the book of Numbers, God describes himself there and elsewhere as the one who dwells between the cherubim. And the little table thing is called the atonement lid or the mercy seat. And then down inside, you've got those stone tablets. That is the symbol of the covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant. But I want to go way beyond just the Ark of the Covenant, because it's not just a storage tank, right? What makes this thing great? Or, here's a better way to say it. Put on your Middle Eastern glasses, if you will, and try to see in this what Middle Eastern people who lived around kings would think of. You come up, you have this really big fancy seat with bodyguards around it, and there is your God sitting right there. There's your king sitting right there. You see it? This is actually a throne. We would be just as well off to call it God's throne as to call it the Ark of the Covenant, because this is where God is sitting. So what you've got again here is God's presence, and like, wow, here we are. This is Eden all over again, right? So it's just a beautiful, beautiful start. So to the people who were reading the blueprints, to the craftsmen who were building it, this was not boring material. This is like, wow, let's pay attention to every detail, because this is God's piece of furniture, right? So it's a really good start, and it's really exciting, but often things don't go well, and they don't go well here. And what doesn't go well is this. In chapter 32, Moses is up on the mountain, and the people say, where did that guy go? And we really, Aaron, we need some gods, right? And so he says, okay, give me your gold, and they give him the gold, right? And he makes this golden calf, obviously pretty bad choice. And God says to Moses, you know what? You got to get down there, because you need to go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. And so Moses goes down, and he looks at Aaron, and he says, Aaron, what were you thinking, man? And Aaron says, well, I took the gold and I threw it in the fire, and out jumped this calf. Yeah, right. And so you look at this, and God's disgusted with him. Moses is kind of disgusted with him, and so Moses responds back to God. I think this is really funny. Moses said, why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought up out of Egypt with a great power and mighty hand? You see what they're doing with each other? What God and Moses are doing? God looks at Moses and says, hey, Moses, look what your people have done. Moses says, hey, God, look what your people have done. Right? Nobody wants to take credit for it. That reminds me of going to the grocery store when the kids were little. And I'd look at my wife and I'd say, did you see what your son did? She'd say, he's not my boy, he's your boy today, right? And neither God nor Moses wants to take credit for these people. God says, they're your people. Moses says, nope, they're your people. I don't want them. So when Moses comes down the mountain, he takes those tablets, and of course he breaks them because, he throws them and breaks them, not because he throws stuff when he gets mad, but because they have already broken some of the commandments. Which ones have they broken? The first one and the second one, right? I mean, they worship other gods and they made idols. And so they had to break them, and God says, okay, come back up the mountain, we'll remake these. But right there, you kind of wonder, I wonder how this is going to end, right? Or, here's another picture. You have a couple, they just get married, they take off on honeymoon, and when they come back, you say, how did it go? And they say, oh, we just fought the whole time. So, what are you going to predict about the future of that marriage? Well, let's just say the honeymoon's over here, and we go back up and rewrite the commandments, but we're wondering, wow, how long is this covenant going to last? So, for now, though, they finished building the temple, and the flow of thought is complete. God has bought them. He has married them and formed the people into one nation under God. and he actually moves in. So I hope you catch the logical flow, right? He wins the girl, marries the girl, and moves in. So indeed, the nation has been formed, and through some recent, just very recent archaeology, we found some fragments that came from little schoolrooms in Israel in the wilderness, and we now know that every morning third graders would stand up by their desk and recite this pledge. I pledge allegiance to the covenant and to the promises for which it stands. One nation, under God, incorrigible, with leader and land for all. Okay, I just made it up, but I thought it was kind of fun. Now, one more real quick thing before we quit, and that is this. And you get to the very end of the book, right? All the way to chapter 40, you find this statement. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the glory of the Lord filled it. Now, I don't know if you just took that as a statement of fact or you realize what was going on here, but I just want you to know that the whole reason why God came and put this tabernacle down in the middle of Israel was so he could meet with people. It's called the tent of meeting. But all of a sudden, the number one guy, Moses, comes up and knocks on the door, and God says, not opening up. It's like, wait a minute. Wait, this is wrong. Moses can't even go in? What? How do you do that? And it kind of reminds me of the kids with great-great-great-grandpa Adam saying, oh, that's so beautiful. How do we get back in? And great-great-grandpa Adam said, well, there's a way, but it's not what you think, right? And the same thing is true for this. Moses is going to get in eventually, but we got a weekend to figure it out, right?